Ladies and gentlemen, if you can have your attention, please. Welcome to the Masterclass, speaking to leveraging private sector water risk analytics to unlock resilience capital. Please welcome the co-founder of Resolve Water ANDWATR, Helen Hulett.
Hi, good morning. I was told this is on. It doesn't seem, is it on? Oh, cool. Cool. If I'm shaky or shivery, although this is quite a big crowd, it's actually because I'm freezing. So I always forget how cold these places are. To be honest, I'm quite surprised how many of this audience have chosen this masterclass. And so I just want to give an introduction in terms of what we're looking at, because this is very private sector based, and I know that this audience is quite public sector today. So to introduce myself, my name's Helen Hulett. I was an engineer at a water and wastewater treatment company for many, not an executive, sorry, not an engineer, at a water and wastewater engineering firm for many years. My role there was to translate and quantify for the private sector why they needed to start managing water. From there, I started two companies. One of them is ANDWATR, where I now consult and advise the private sector, but mainly the banking sector, on why they need to start looking at water risk within their portfolios, and then quantifying that for them, and helping them develop solutions in terms of how they can manage that risk, okay? The other company that we co-founded, I've done it in partnership with AfriGIS, which is a Vodacom company. And what we're basically doing there is using LLMs, we are geospatially mapping water risk starting with South Africa. So you'll be able to click on any location in South Africa, and you get from the catchment level all the way down to the water service provider how large the risk is. It then translates it, if you're a food and bev facility, if you're a mine, what it means financially for you in the short, medium, and long term. How much production are you going to lose? It then looks at, okay, well, what solution should we be implementing to manage that risk, and who could we partner with? Where can we get finance for that solution? Okay, so today's, yes, sorry. Resolve Water. So it's called Resolve Water over there. Next week, we're hosting our first launch webinar. So if you would like to attend, please give me your details, and I'll send you the invite. It's been really exceptionally interesting using LLMs to sift through 200,000 documents, because most of the government's documents are in PDF, and pulling it out and then geospatially tagging everything to every location. Okay. So today's masterclass, and we'll try and keep it as interactive as possible, and Mike Smith from the Water Fund is going to help me. We are really just looking at, from a private sector, how do you effectively manage water risk in South Africa and Africa? What solutions should you be looking at, and then what financing solutions? I'm not a financial person, so I'm hoping this group will also have some ideas and new thoughts for me today. Before we start, can I just get a show of hands? Who is from the public sector? So a utility, a water service provider. So just so I understand. Okay, perfect, thank you. Please bear with me. I couldn't make this a public sector masterclass, but I'm hoping to give you some idea in terms of how the private sector looks at this risk. Who is from a financial institution? Okay, bear with me. My financial terminology is terrible. And then who are from service providers and engineering companies? Okay, you're going to have to bear with me even more. My engineering terminology is terrible. Okay, so together, hopefully will make sense to some of you. Okay, so the main problem, so for years, working with the private sector on this, working with the mines, the food and beverage facilities, the pulp and paper facilities, it started off as a problem of trying to get everyone to understand that the country or the continent has a water risk, okay? That's no longer the issue anymore. Companies know, the private sector knows they have a water risk. When I work with the financial sector, They know that there's a water risk linked to their banking portfolios, whether it's agric or mining. It's really got to the stage now of effectively translating that. So we know there's a water risk. What does that mean? How big of a financial risk is it to us? And what solution could we implement? Okay. In South Africa and Africa, it's very different. If you talk to a DFI from Europe, I had quite a frustrating conversation on Friday with a DFI from Europe, and they just wanted to translate water risk into a climate change initiative. How can we fund this based on climate change? It's very different in South Africa and Africa. It's a structural risk. It's not episodic anymore. It's continual. It's infrastructure that's degrading, it's water treatment plants, it's non-revenue water. So it's translating that reality for private sector. The framework that we use to do this is pretty simple. We first have to understand the operational impact, okay, how water risk manifests in the business. Okay. What companies are doing in South Africa at the moment, what they have been doing, is that they'll hear the term water risk, and the immediate response will be, well, let's co-invest in an initiative in the catchment that looks at alien plant removal, okay? That's not very effective for a company because it's not managing their specific risk in most instances. It's not a bad initiative, but a lot of the companies in South Africa need to be far more targeted in terms of what investment they're doing, okay? And that turns to understanding the driver. Where in your water supply chain is your risk sitting? How large is that risk? And what is the driver behind that risk? Is it a water treatment plant that hasn't been maintained in 10 years? Is it augmentation that hasn't occurred in the catchment? So today, a lot of what we'll go through is understanding that driver. Then it's calculating the financial exposure. This is actually quite easy to do for the private sector. Okay? You can get quite in depth, but you can also do an easy rule of thumb. It's then connecting the correct solution, and then it's performance monitoring. Okay. Any questions before we go on? It's very meant to be interactive. Any thoughts so far? Nothing. Will someone say something? Yes, thank you. Mm. 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 Yes. Well, that's perfect. And you're right. So data does two things. It enables it to scale, and we'll go through that. Because right now, why projects aren't scaling in the private sector is because the solution and the risk is so customized to the location. So projects are very interdispersed. One project here, another project over there, and it takes ages to develop the pre-feasibility for those projects because you need to examine exactly the specifics around water at that location. What data and LLMs allow you to do is now scale that. So you're able to, at a far broader level, identify what potential projects there are, how feasible those projects are, and what impact those projects will do. And then also, obviously, data is monitoring and verification on the other end. A company will only invest in a solution if they can actually prove that it's having an impact. So yes, it's a good question. We'll go through it. Thank you. Mm.
And sorry, can you help me to understand why the operational impact comes before the driver? In my mind,
it comes, yeah, the other way around. Yeah. So why it comes here, and it's a good, in a previous version of this slide, it actually came after the driver. Why it comes first is because when I go into a company, the first thing they tell me is my membranes are clogging up so they see the operational impact and then they can't link it to the driver. So for the private sector, they immediately see the operational impact first, that's why they call you in to develop a water strategy or a solution for them. And then from there, you've got to link it back to the driver. What's happening a lot in the private sector at the moment in industry is they're feeling the operational impact, but they don't know how to link it to a driver. So they invest in a project that's actually not going to reduce their risk. Okay. But it can go on, it goes on both sides, because you have the operational impact, the driver, and then you've got to figure out how large the operational impact is for each of those drivers. So it's a going back and forth mechanism.
So it's kind of like the driver is almost the root cause in the way that this is being
Yes. It's the signal that gets them to actually start looking deeper into the system. Cool. So just understanding the difference between signal and driver. For the last about 15 years, all companies would talk about is, okay, we know we have a water risk, or we know that a water risk is going to come our way. And they would say we have a higher water risk, or their environmental team will say you have a higher water risk. And boards didn't know what to do with this information. You can't make a financial decision based on, I have a high water risk. Okay, so that's where the translation came into it. Okay, so how high is that water risk? Let me translate that into the boardroom talk so that they understand, okay, But what a lot of companies are doing, and what still happens in South Africa a lot because of the news, is they focus on the signals. And that's what we see. That's not actually where the risk lies. So it's very important to understand, okay, well, what's a signal? What do we observe? And signals alert us to vulnerabilities. They do not tell us what to fund. Okay, so a signal might be that we got high non-revenue water in eThekwini, okay? But it doesn't help them figure out the strategy. We have to get down to the driver. So if a company is complaining of intermittent supply, it can actually be caused by a number of things, and you need to start delving up into their water supply chain to figure out what it is, so that you can identify the project that they need to start looking at. So it could be a system imbalance caused by non-river water, it could be asset reliability, so pump stations, it could be a storage deficit. Load shedding caused this a lot, where reservoirs were intermittently filling up and emptying. And it could also just be revenue fragility. So there's no maintenance being done. And this is where data becomes quite important, because this is very location specific. So if I'm a Coca-Cola and I've got 13 bottling plants around the country, this risk profile looks exceptionally different for each operation. But being able to pull on the data and not have to do a full research study for each one of your operations, but to be able to pull on all the data that tells you what your drivers are and how significant they are, really helps you scale the interventions. Okay, and then how to tell whether you're effectively managing water. And this is only just happening now. When someone in the organization says, we have a significant water risk, is it actually changing any decisions within your organization? Historically in South Africa, it hasn't. It hasn't caused any capex to be put forward. It hasn't changed anything. Okay, we are now getting to the point where when someone's talking about water risk, they actually need something to be done, and so they need to understand that risk a little bit more effectively. Okay, and the exercise. Any questions while we do that? I suppose you can't hear me without this thing here. It's quite disorientating, hear myself backing, getting off the back wall. Can you hand this up? Sorry. Okay. So we're going to go through a quick exercise. You get to be me for like 30 minutes. Yeah, just a few on each table. I only did all this information is going to actually be on the presentation. It's just so that you can read it yourself. So if you get called into a bottling facility, okay, it's producing a cold drink. I've kept it quite simple. It could be a pulp and paper facility, a mine, whatever it is. So the scenario we're going to use is a beverage bottling facility in South Africa. Okay, it needs continuous production, 24/7 operations. It has no tolerance for unplanned downtime. It has zero tolerance for micro deviations, a high fixed cost base, type distribution contracts, and it relies on municipal water. Okay? Its supply chain, if you want to just like break it down, it relies on catchment water being fed to the water board, being fed to the WSA, being fed to the WSP, and then it goes into its facility. Okay. What I often get when going into a facility is that the engineer will come to you with a whole bunch of issues. Okay. Over the past 18 months, supply interruptions have increased from occasional events to 18 to 14 events per year. Okay, this is quite significant in South Africa at the moment. They're experiencing pressure drops in the incoming, which means they can't keep their production at a level that it needs to be. Incoming water turbidity and quality is very variable at the moment. The municipality has indicated that major pipeline maintenance has been repeatedly deferred. And there has been rumor that going forward, the catchment in which they operate is going to start going into deficit. Okay, and they look to you to now say, okay, well, how can we manage this solution? I'm doing it at a facility level for this example, just to give you an example of how you can translate it. But you can also, so a bank will come to you and say, within my industrial portfolio, can you tell me where the biggest risks are in terms of lost production and revenue? And you do the same process, you do it just for 1,000 facilities instead of one. So the exercise is, one, identifying the primary operational impacts. Two, identifying what drivers could be causing this. Then calculating the financial exposure, developing the solution fit, and then looking at, okay, well, what monitoring do we need to do in order to ensure that this project is bankable and is actually achieving what it needs to do? And that also comes into what you mentioned about reporting, because a lot of companies won't invest in a solution, whether it be a non-revenue water solution, if they don't have the auditable data coming out the other end, because they can't what do you call it, claim those benefits towards their targets. Any questions? So what we're basically going to do, I'm going to take you through a quick example. But before I go into that, any other questions, thoughts? And if you want to go through to the AMI procurement masterclass at this point, feel free. No. Oh. Okay, so you got to look at your, if you look at this, we're first going to look at drivers. It was, supply, operational impact. Which of these is having the most immediate impact on operations that you could say? And it would have, for a bottling facility, under these conditions, it needs to run full day, it needs it 24/7, it needs its pressure and its water supply to be continuous. Under this condition, which do you think is having the largest operational impact? Sorry? Supply interruptions. Okay, that's the most immediate. And what you find in South Africa is you can't just look at one of them, though, because what is happening at the moment is the water service provider impacts are usually the most immediate. Okay, so they happen first, and they have the biggest impacts on operations at the moment. Okay. However, the way that South Africa is also structured and our water scarcity and growth that is happening is that we need to understand, okay, in the short term, water supply interruptions are our biggest operational impact, but in the medium term, and potentially, the medium term, it's actually water supply availability that could potentially impact our operations, and you need to be able to quantify both of those. And then you've got to throw quality into the mix. Okay. So for this operation, this just hypothetical, and it's not every operation, it's just this operation, the biggest impact is going to be supply interruptions, unplanned flow stoppages or pressure drops, which is happening at a high frequency. Quality deviation could potentially have a significant impact, but it's got a lower probability. So if they have a micro breaking through into the production, they have to recall all of their product or dump product, which causes a significant amount of financial loss, but it's not as immediate and continuous as supply interruptions. Abstraction restrictions are a real thing, okay, but it's medium term, it's not immediate. And then discharge constraints. So let's just say they aren't allowed to discharge higher volumes, and so they have a growth limiter. Okay. When it comes to supply interruptions, you then have to look at, okay, well, what are the drivers of that? How can we correctly identify what is causing that supply? And I know this might seem tedious, but it's just a methodological process that you have to go through to be able to correctly link the impact to the driver, because that's where projects fail. If you can't correctly link the impact to the driver, the project isn't going to work and no one's going to fund it. Okay, and whether you're talking to your CEO or whether you're talking to the bank, that's always the case. So potential drivers, yeah.
Question on this. At this stage, how would you be able to identify that there are abstraction restrictions and discharge?
Limitation. So the discharge, don't worry about the discharge. That wasn't put in, but this is the bottom one. The Catchment Authority has warned that water availability might tighten during dry years. So water availability is dropping in that catchment as populations grow. So they're running out of water. So that's how you, and the way that water availability translates for the private sector is on restrictions. So ANDWATR has to start restricting your water uses as DWS restricts their water usage. Okay, and then I think on your sheet, sorry I didn't print, potential drivers for this. Can anyone identify which would be a potential driver? Anyone? Maintenance, yes. So, what you do, and it's a very useful process that the private sector should all get used to doing, is you actually map your supply chain. A lot of companies don't do this, they don't know this. They just think water comes from their water service provider, but you've got to map it all the way up to the catchment in terms of who's their water service provider, who's their water service authority, who is their bulk water supplier, and who is running the catchment, and what does that catchment look like? Who's the CMA? Okay. For this facility, the dominant near-term risk is deferred maintenance and aging infrastructure driving supply interruptions, okay, at the WSA, WSP level. So you know in your strategy and in your project, you need to develop a project that is focused on the WSA, the Water Service Authority, and it looks at decreasing supply interruptions. You then can go through in the financial exposure mechanisms. It's really simple. So you can go into a lot of depth and you can model your entire industrial ecosystem to say, okay, what happens if I started increasing the amount of supply interruptions, decreasing the quality, how does my facility respond? But you can also just do a quick calculation to say, if I have 18 to 14 days of intermittent supply, what does that mean in lost production? You figure out how the facility responds to supply interruptions, and you just make that into a rand, a financial number. Okay, so if you know from this that you have a 30 million rand short-term exposure due to supply interruptions, so you can then quantify all of your potential risks, and this helps you figure out, you're going back to the operational impact in terms of what is the operational impact of each of those drivers, and you know who is responsible, who is sitting there with the responsibility for that driver. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but any questions on that? You'll see at the top, it says your short term, your supply interruptions are driven by distribution system reliability failures, primarily from deferred maintenance, with peak demand exceeding capacity acting as an amplifying factor. Medium-term quality instability and maintenance backlog compound the system stress increases, and then long-term basin allocation restrictions become the binding structural constraint. So we need to deal with the short-term impacts, but not forget that we have a long-term impact as well. Okay. At the moment, so none of these, until you're looking at the long-term, doing an alien vegetation removal process in the catchment isn't going to sort out your short-term impact. You need to be focusing on that. Okay, and then site interventions, and this is where it gets interesting, and this is probably where, so I believe the private sector has an extremely strong and important role to play in actually achieving water resilience within South Africa, okay? And yes, it's one, improving their own management of their own water internally. That helps a lot, so reducing the usage, improving efficiencies, making sure the wastewater that they discharge is of the correct quality. But it's also then at a collaborative level saying, okay, well, if I'm an Ekurhuleni and the main driver is water supply interruptions or decreases in pressure, what do I need to do? What can I look at to manage that driver, and who can I collaborate with? Because the private sector is also very happy now to, one, collaborate with government, but then also collaborate with the other industrial players in that space. So what collaborative project could we pull together that will decrease our risk directly, and how do we monitor and manage that? And that's where this space is going, and that's why it's quite interesting that the financial sector is also starting to look at this within their portfolios, because they have a huge power to start looking at, okay, well, we have a concentration of risk within this area. It's our industrial players. What collaborative project could we start looking at to develop that manages their risk, and how can we engage with government and the public sector to do that? And that's a real conversation that's happening at the moment. Okay, I've given just an example of WSA supply interruptions. On site, you can increase your storage reserves, real-time pressure monitoring at intake points, but then you have to start looking out of the boundary as well to how can we start facilitating non-revenue water loss, the O&M of those projects and the performance base of those projects. Okay, then getting into performance monitoring, and it's what you're asking, there's not enough data at the moment. So the big problem with non-revenue water projects and bigger projects is there's not enough base data at the moment to actually make those projects feasible and bankable. But as that improves, we have to ensure that we are monitoring the correct things to be able to tell us what we need to make a project bankable. Okay. So what doesn't work, and I've given some examples, and then what does work. What are those metrics that we need to be pulling together to ensure that a project is feasible? Okay, any questions on that before we go? Very quick, yes.
Thank you. You're a bottling facility. You've managed to get your expertise in to help and sort this out. You need a financer to back you.
Yes.
Right? What are the funders looking for? Because we hear over and over again that we don't have enough bankable projects, but we have enough capital. So just from your experience, what do you think that narrative is about, and do you have the specifics of what currently people who are financing and actively looking to finance water projects are looking for?
I'm going to actually turn that over to Mike, because Mike is part of the Water Fund who finances these types of projects for the private sector. But basically, at a high level, what they are looking for is well-constructed projects. So they want to understand who owns the risk. Is it actually going to sort out the issue, which is also what boards are looking for. How much does this project actually reduce our risk? And then they want the data around it that ensures that they understand the baseline, and they also understand that the baseline is moving. Unfortunately, where we have been in the last 5 to 10 years is no one's understood the sector well enough to be able to say, okay, to put exactly that together, like this package to say, how do I make this project financeable? But it is getting there, and that's why also increase in data is making a massive difference, because to do a non-revenue water project, you do need the data. The private sector needs the data to be able to solidify a baseline and then ensure that they are able to account for the benefits. Mike?
Yeah, look, I hope I can add a little bit there, but obviously a very different situation when you're looking at public sector versus private sector projects. I think everybody is quite familiar with what the challenge is in the public sector space, and that's typically bankability driven by revenue uncertainty. So are you going to get paid? In the private sector space, it's what Helen's presenting here is so interesting because it's really the key starting point for all of these projects that stimulate security or improve the security of these industries. And Helen and I have worked on some projects before, quite some years ago, where we've done a lot of background work around the risks of these industries and really got to grips with what their challenges were, their immediate, their long-term. But these are all kind of just words within a report that says you might run out of water and that might cost you X billion rand in 10 years' time or something. And you're presenting this to a board and it's just might, you know, there's no strength behind it. And that's what this data that Helen and her team and other people, you know, are really getting to grips with now, is they're trying to give credence to these risks. You know, to actually back up those assertions with the data that can actually make the decision much easier. But from that private sector perspective, the easiest projects to fund are obviously the ones that have the direct financial impact. So when you're looking at water reuse, for example, how much does the water cost you? How much is the reuse project going to cost you? So what's the marginal difference, the arbitrage between those two rates, so to speak? Those are kind of the easy ones. The ones that Helen and team are kind of focusing on more is actually the bigger impact ones, where we need to understand what the risks are and what the broader play is there. But as I said, it needs to be driven by that security of, well, security, the confidence in the data. Yeah, I don't know if there's anything else to add there.
While we have a finance person here, though, anyone got an acronym? So, yeah?
Hi, Helen. So there's not a finance question, but it has to do with your step 3, the financial assessment part. To what level of detail or accuracy do you have to complete the financial assessment part? Because that's the quantitative space. Because obviously that's the motivation for the projects that would come from it. What level of accuracy or detail do you go to?
So it depends on the level of project. So if you get called in by a big pulp and paper facility, then you actually model then it goes into huge detail. You model the catchment and the water service provider, and then you model their water balance and how their facility responds to water on a quality and volume basis. And it's almost like a live digital twin that you run to say, okay, well, how is this going to change? That's detail. That is a huge amount of detail. If you're just looking within your portfolio, banking portfolio, you want to do a quick pilot to see, well, what is the quantum of the risk within my different sectors? Where is my risk consolidating? Because remember that with water, this is an interesting by the side, water obviously is very localized, so you find that your risk is quite significant in certain areas, but then it also impacts collateral. So banks who in the previously would have said, it's fine because we have, we manage our risk through collateral. There's also then a potential loss in value within that collateral because it's also all in one area. So when one farmer fails, all 10 of the farmers within that area fail. So when you're doing it at a portfolio level, you can just do a quick screening. If you know, all you need to know is what type of facility it is, what it's producing, and you can model potential what the loss is. You can then delve deeper when you have to go, okay, well, we know that this type of project will sort this out. That's when the more in-depth modeling comes. Yeah.
My volume. Do I need the microphone?
No, you need to punch yourself.
I don't. Okay. Okay. So the question is the accountability for deciding that these projects are needed. So in this case study, we've obviously looked at this bottling plant, and the bottling plant is the customer at the end of the day is impacted by not being able to go through their normal operations. But when we're thinking about this at really understanding the overall exposure and the accountability for fixing these things, would it be the bottling plant that kicks off this kind of project, or would that be a bit further up in the supply chain?
a good question. So, I don't know if this is working. No.
Yeah, it is.
It is it? Okay, cool. It doesn't bounce back as much, which is nice. The responsibility at the moment sits, it sits with the facility. Well, I don't know if the responsibility sits there, but who's doing this is one, the facility, so that they can start, or the company, so they can understand if we're going to grow, if we're going to consolidate, where do we need to do that? Okay, and how do we manage that risk? And I don't know if just correct me if I'm not answering the question, but not enough private sector individual companies are currently doing that in South Africa. So that's why the banks are starting to get involved, because you can consolidate up the potential for scaling water resilience project through the financial sector's portfolio. And that's where it becomes interesting. So you're not doing it one by one by one anymore. And then it's the bank's responsibility, and this is where a place they're playing in the moment is going to grow, is then how do we reduce our risk by supporting our clients to ensure that they're becoming more resilient. And I think for the financial sector, that is a huge area of responsibility. You're going to see them playing more and more in going forward. What kind of financial solutions should we be producing? Solar was easy. Okay, when it comes to water, far more complicated. So how do they do this? Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
We need more data to be able to really justify the solutions.
Yes.
There are multiple layers in this chain.
Perfect. Cool. Any other questions on that? Okay, so just as 3 key observations, because I think it's nearly lunch, is where South Africa, and it's not just South Africa, and Africa is far more advanced in this space. When it comes to water, I work a lot in the US and Europe, and working in South Africa is almost so much more interesting because this market is so much more mature in terms of its understanding of water risk and what needs to be done. So in South Africa, we've got to the point now where awareness is widespread. Okay, we just need to now upskill in terms of how do we develop a solution that is actually managing our key risk driver. Okay, that's slowly starting to happen, but what you do need in that space is more data. You need to understand what the water service provider is doing. You need to understand how CMAs are being pulled together, catchment management agencies, what the water board is doing, and what the opportunities there are. Okay, and it's a very collaborative space. So unfortunately, I know a lot of private sector don't like to engage government on certain things, but in order to get this right, we really do need to start doing that. Okay, and capital can't finance signal, so what makes a project bankable is proving that it's actually going to have an impact on the risk that you're feeling. Okay. It's becoming more and more important to be able to, with data, show a board or show a bank or show whoever it is, that if I implement this solution, you will start to see an impact on our risk levels. Okay, and then the gap is diagnostic, it's not financial. If you can produce a bankable project, there's more than enough money out there that wants to finance it. You just have to package it in the right way. And then why this is all important, why are we talking about this at what is really mainly a public sector event, is because if we can get this right, the private sector actually has a significant role to play in developing resilience within our catchments. Okay, if you can get to a point where the facility is managing water correctly, so it's efficient, it's driving down its usage, and it's not discharging waste that isn't compliant, it then starts to develop data and information in terms of what's actually happening in that area, and most importantly, you're able to aggregate private action. Okay, and that's where collaboration, everyone always talks about the water space being a collaborative space, and we have to start improving our collaboration. And that's really the only way to do it, is once, if you're in an industrial area, if you're in an agricultural area, if you can fully understand the drivers and what's going to have the best impact in reducing the risk for that area, then you can start aggregating these responses that everyone can collaborate on and to start scaling it more broadly. Cool. And that was it from me. 3 more minutes. Does anyone have any questions or thoughts? Yeah, I think. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Thank you. Testing, testing. Testing again. Oh, there we go. The analytics engine that you're using, the
Yes.
LLM, how are you validating the outputs of that?
Yeah, so there's a whole team doing that to check that the LLMs are stable. So there's two things that you got to remember with this system. We're not making up any of the data. The data is government data. You have to use government data because government is the one responsible for water in the country. They've done so much research over the last 20 years in terms of what's happening at the different levels and the catchments and all of that. So we're not making up data. It's feeding off government-approved information and data, and then feeding in approved data sets as well. And then the team we just go through and we validate, we run it and run it and run it. So that is the Vodacom company's responsibility. That is what they do. They power Google Maps in Africa. The validation side is their strong point. And there's a whole process which I don't go too deeply into, but it's being validated, yeah. Okay, any other questions? Or should we, yes, yeah, Green Cape and then, yeah.
Thanks. So this is more of a GIS question. Is this on which delineations? Is it quaternary catchments?
It goes all, so whatever government has basically, it's all government data that's ever been published, or if we can, so the Water Partnership Office is also feeding us information and we'll expand like that, but it'll have all information from, so all the way down, all the different levels of catchments, water service providers, water service authorities, water boards, and when they change, compliance data from all the water treatment plants, wastewater treatment plants. It's just a full database of all the countries' information. So if you click onto it, you can go down to whatever level you're looking for.
Yeah.
If we can, I can tell you the government likes to change delineations quite a lot though. I know, it's like a...
Yeah, thanks. So since we obviously have a room full of private sector individuals, I thought I should also mention something that you said, in that the National Treasury sometime last year published what we call unsolicited bid framework, allowing private sector companies to propose solutions and partner with public sector institution in order to come up with solutions around water and other services. And I thought that it's quite important because oftentimes we look at solutions only from the public sector point of view.
Yeah.
But I think that there's quite a lot of innovation that may come from private sector, and we haven't seen those kind of proposals coming through from the private sector side. So I think it would be great for one to go to the National Treasury website to download those unsolicited bid framework guidelines so that we can begin to see more projects that are coming from private sector, and hopefully we can jointly come with a solution towards some of the problems that we have in the public sector. Thanks.
And just like building on from that, it's quite a controversial thing to say, but in this space, in the water space, I do feel a little bit that the private sector isn't doing as much as the public sector at the moment. The amount of reforms, the changes, the investment that is happening in the public sector is massive. And the private sector almost just needs to get on board. So thank you. Yeah, agreed. Bryn.
Thank you for the masterclass. It was very interesting. Maybe some observations as well. I like the way that you're putting the kind of the site-specific thing together with what's happening in the public space. Two references maybe on the more public kind of data side is the WWF water risk filter. I wanted to ask how that kind of incorporates that part. And a second follow-up question, if I may, on the local side, the other reference point that I have is the AWS Alliance for Water Stewardship. And my experience with that particular framework has been that it's quite cumbersome. So for something like this to work, it needs to be really easy for the users.
So on the WWF front, we are talking to WWF because they obviously only go down to a certain level. They look a lot at catchment level, whereas we're going down into the infrastructure and what projects and what needs to be rolled out. So we are in discussions with WWF. And AWS, I know what you mean by, it's quite a long booklet that. No, exactly that. What we want at the end of the day is the private sector they don't need to understand the risk too deeply. We want to take that pressure off of them. We need to be able to scale. So they just need to understand how big is my risk and what do I need to do about it. So that's the main outcomes. And then who can I partner with and who can I get finance from? So that there's no process that the private sector really has to go through. It's, okay, you're sitting here, you need to be looking at a reuse or non-revenue water and it'll decrease your risk by this much, and here are the financing solutions and the project collaborators, if you're interested. So it's not a certification process or anything like that.
It's more operational.
Yes.
Very good. Thanks.
Yes.
Thank you. On the case study that you have given us, the industry has got a risk of water interruption and that of quality, and the discharge of effluent that is non-compliant. Now, when looking at finance or financing models, between the two parties, the public, for example, the municipality and the industry, who is in a better opportunity to get finance when the application is submitted? Who should submit? The Water Service Authority or the industry? Remember, both of these parties are having a problem, or they know that they have a problem and they know what the problem is. So who should submit the application? And two, to the room, in terms of the partnerships, for example, there are opportunities on wastewater reuse and there are opportunities on non-revenue water and the improvement of the infrastructure. These partnerships, can the municipality or Water Service Authority have these partnerships, more than one partnership, for example, if I get a chance to apply and get funding for the non-revenue water, can I also apply for the wastewater reuse as well as refurbishment of my wastewater treatment works? Can I have more than one, as a municipality, can I have more than one partnerships with different different entities while I'm only one Water Service Authority? Thank you.
Mike, do you have any?
Yeah, so I don't know that somebody might be better equipped to answer, but my limited experience of it is each of these projects are so case specific that to your first point, I wouldn't be able to tell you which route would be better. It depends on the Water Service Authority and the municipality, all the players. So yeah, couldn't answer that. And then to the second point again, I don't know the immediate answer, but I don't think that there's any problem in multiple applications for these type of projects as long as the benefit is clear.
Okay. Any other questions, or are you happy to break for lunch? Cool. Well, thank you, everyone.